Welcome, and one more welcome to everybody. Part of our continuing discussion, continuing the series with thinkers and thoughtful people on the left, on the right, all from around America, in academia, not in academia, activists, philosophers, politicians, and professors, and postdoc researchers. We're interviewing them all as part of our continuing discussion. With us today is Jeffrey Lees. He's an associate research scholar at the Behavioral Science for Policy Lab at Princeton University, at the Kahneman Treisman Center for Behavioral Science and Public Policy at Princeton University. He's a research scholar, not a professor. I got that wrong. He works at the Adlinger Center for Energy and the Environment at Princeton University. He's been at Princeton University as an associate research scholar at the School for Public and International Affairs, Adlinger Center for Energy and the Environment, Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment. He's also been at Clemson University as a visiting assistant professor in disinformation. He's been educated, or he's been a faculty research fellow at George Washington University and an adjunct professor at Clemson University. He received a PhD from Harvard, an MA from the University of Chicago, and a BA from the University of Maine at Farmington in psychology and political science. He utilizes experimental methods to study the prevalence and causes of inaccurate beliefs and how they drive negative outcomes. I examine the dynamics of inaccurate beliefs across organizational, political, and climate contexts. I'm an associate research scholar at Princeton University in the Behavioral Science for Policy Lab in the Adlinger Center for Energy and the Environment, where I research the psychology of climate change belief traps. Under Dr. Elke Weber, I'm also affiliated with the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment, also at Princeton. Today, we were going to talk about this article, Understanding and Combating Misperceived Polarization, publishing the Royal Society. And this is roughly what it said. By many accounts, politics is becoming more polarized, yielding dire consequences for democracy and trust in government. Yet a growing body of research on so-called false polarization finds that perceptions of what the other side believes are inaccurate, specifically overly pessimistic, and that these inaccuracies exacerbate intergroup conflict. Through a review of existing work and a reanalysis of published data, we develop a typology of the disparate phenomena that are labeled polarization. Use that typology to distinguish actual from misperceived polarization and identify when misperceived polarization gives rise to actual polarization, extreme issue attitudes, and prejudice. We further suggest that a specific psychological domain is ideal for developing corrective interventions, meta-perception, one's judgment of how they are perceived by others. We review evidence indicating that correcting meta-perception inaccuracies is effective at reducing intergroup conflict and discuss methods for precisely measuring meta-conception accuracy. So roughly, I think this is saying that people have negative opinions about the other side. They're cut off from information. They can develop negative, false impressions of the other side, and that just exacerbates tensions. But let's find out from the source. Jeffrey, did I get anything wrong? Is there anything I need to correct? Is there something with the bio we should go over again?
Nope, that is great. Thank you very much. Yeah, like I said, I've been in many positions, but currently a formal title is associate research scholar. But more broadly, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton. I'm actually, the article that we're discussing is about these inaccurate beliefs as they relate to polarization. But at Princeton, I'm studying that in the context of climate change. But it's happy to jump into many details there about this article and beyond. Thank you so much for having me.
We're not going to get into climate change. And I'm just going to say that up front because I work in climate change, so I very much want to talk to you about perceptions of climate change. I also live in the Central Valley here in California, and California is a pioneer on climate change, but in the Central Valley, we have a lot of people who say, I just don't believe it. But conversation for another day. Is this article roughly saying growing body of research on so-called false polarization finds that perceptions on what the other side believes are inaccurate and overly pessimistic, and these inaccuracies exacerbate intergroup conflict? I have read where there's some polling, and tell me if this relates or not, and it says Republicans think that a lot of Democrats are part of some pedophile pizza conspiracy, and a lot of Democrats think that Republicans all believe January 6th was cool and a good idea. And I've also talked to a lot of liberals, and they said, well, everybody at January 6th was a violent insurrectionist, and all of them wanted to overthrow the government. And I've actually talked to people at January 6th. Yes, there were bad people there. Yes, it was a coup. There were thousands of people there. Only a couple hundred actually made it into the building. If you talk to a lot of liberals, they're the impression that all 13,000 somehow made it into the building, and they were all for that. We could also flip it on the other side. All the fires during the summer of Black Lives Matter protests were started by Black Lives Matter people because they hate organization and they want to burn everything down, all of them. I've heard both of these philosophies. Everybody's this bad person. Everybody believed in that bad philosophy. And it's easy when you start falling into that, it's easy to then hold the worst possible opinions about this group because you're just willing to believe anything. And you have no realistic perception of how bad they are. They did it all. All 22 cities was burned by BLM. All 13,000 people were there to overthrow the government. And neither one of those statistics is true. Yet I've met a lot of people who believe that. Is that roughly getting to what you're talking about, or is it more nuanced?
Yes to both those questions. So my research interests broadly, and in this instance, is understanding these false beliefs about what the other side believes. So in the broadest sense, that is false polarization. Inaccurate and overly negative beliefs about what the other side believes. Right. And so this can be, there's many different ways to think about this. And one of the reasons I wrote this article was to help think about that very scientifically. So the audience for this article is actually other scientists, because one of my primary arguments is we as scientists are not very precise when we're precise when we measure polarization, but we use that term to describe a lot of different things that are meaningfully distinct, even if they all follow the same pattern, right? So you just laid out a bunch of instances, right, where one side holds an overly negative or pessimistic or uncharitable belief about the other side, and so we can imagine, or you might imagine at baseline, those are all related. There's, so Democrats might hold a bunch of negative beliefs about what Republicans believe, right? And so it's worth here thinking about these aren't just polarization per se, right? Like if a Democrat hates Republicans or says I severely dislike the Republican Party and all its members, like they're polarized in the broadest sense of the term. Here we're interested in judgments that have some true value. So it's not, does that Democrat hate Republicans? It's, does that Democrat think 50% of Republicans, or for example, does that Democrat think 80% of Republicans support the January 6th coup attempt, when in fact a tiny group do, right? So it's a judgment that is sort of, in as far as we can call it, objectively inaccurate. And so, part of the article is looking at the literature, the scientific body of work on that phenomena very broadly. When do we have inaccurate and overly negative perceptions about what the other group believes, and tries to organize that, say, there are a lot of different people have a lot of attitudes, and people have a lot of misperceptions of other attitudes, right? So one's perception of what the other side thinks about January 6th might be meaningfully different than what one thinks the other side thinks about abortion, which might be meaningfully different from what one thinks the other side thinks about immigration. And when I say meaningfully different, what I mean is psychologically different, right? My background is a psychologist, so I'm interested in what drives these misperceptions, what causes them, and what negative outcomes do they engender when people hold them. And if we assume incorrectly that there's just like a single cause and a single outcome of every different misperception, we might, if that's wrong, then we're developing interventions and we're making policy suggestions that are based on sort of assumptions rather than good data. And so what I try to do is I try to provide a framework for saying, here are all the ways we can think about like actual polarization. Again, that example of just like, I hate the other side, and then perceived polarization. So I think the other side thinks X, and then measuring that, right? So now there's a question of defining the misperception, measuring the misperception, and then a larger body of scientific work understanding what causes that misperception, what does it cause people to do, and thinking about that in a really broad sense, because that's what I want to spend the rest of my life doing, is understanding the nature of these misperceptions. And so this was an attempt to start building a broader framework. To the second half of what this paragraph is about, so we make these distinctions of, right, people have issue positions, right? And so people might here, let me give you an example of one thing I try to distinguish in this article. People have issue positions, right? People have positions about abortion, immigration, foreign policy, etc. And my misjudgment of what the other side thinks on average about those is probably, and there's some evidence to suggest, unrelated from my perception of, say, how extreme they are, how they identify, right? Because those are different. How you identify is different from the sort of intergroup emotions that you have, which are different from your sort of more intellectual policy positions. And what we identify here is a particular subset of those judgments which are wrong. We know they're wrong. A lot of my work shows that they're wrong. And in particular, that they're very amenable to correction. And that is what this meta perception is. So again, here we're defining a very specific judgment, and the specific judgment we're trying to identify is inaccurate meta perception. So in this context, what that means is what I think you think of me. So for example, if I say you think this shirt looks great on me, that's a meta perception. That's my judgment of how you perceive me. Maybe it's wrong, right? This is a toy example, but like maybe you hate how my shirt looks, right? So that's an inaccurate meta perception. So it's one thing to say Democrats think Republicans are all evangelicals when in fact only a percentage of them are evangelicals. That's an inaccurate perception. But a meta perception in this context is, what do Democrats think Republicans think about Democrats? And so there's a large body of work, much of which I've done, which is showing that specific judgment is highly inaccurate. So even though polarization is increasing, and specifically that means like dislike of the out party, right? So Republicans dislike Democrats more and Democrats dislike Republicans more on average than they have in the near past. That is a true pattern. But people vastly overestimate the extent to which that is true. And so that's a meta perception. And so we lay out that why we think that is a really fruitful domain for understanding these inaccurate beliefs and intervening on them. And that's a lot of my research too, because not only one of the things that I find most interesting about these meta perceptions is it really matters, right? Like you and I could talk all day and have a very enjoyable conversation that would not be diminished by, say, me having a wrong guess about your position on whatever policy, right? Like that's not necessarily relevant to our interaction. But whether you like me, whether you want to spend more time with me, whether you think I'm a good person, that actually does have, thank you. that actually does have relevance to our interpersonal interaction, right? It's to use a word I think
Right,
I use
right.
in this abstract that you're showing here. It's reputational. It's about how other people perceive you.
So if I
And
think you're a monster inside, I'm probably not one going to be your friend.
exactly. And
Okay.
if that's true, and I think you think I'm great, I'm going to be like, hey man, let's hang out. And you're going to be like, no man, like, you can just imagine,
Oh.
you can see how that inaccurate belief affects my behavior towards you in a way that, like, if I think you're pro-life and in fact you're pro-choice, like, that's not going to lead to, that might lead to some, conflict at an intellectual level, but that's not going to that's not going to make our social interactions awkward, right? It's not going to potentially lead to intergroup conflict. But let me put it like a finer point on it. Imagine we're just not, people chatting on the internet, where politicians sitting literally in a room, right, or committee, and I'm a Democrat, and I say, there's no way that my Republican colleagues are going to support this moderate proposal, so I'm not even going to bother. I'm not going to not only am I not going to bother presenting it, I'm just going to assume that they're going to be really hostile to me, and then I'm just going to come in the gate being really hostile towards them. And
Okay.
what if that perception was false? What if the Republicans were saying, we would be happy, like they would have been fine with that moderate proposal, right? You can see how in that hypothetical, this inaccurate judgment exacerbates conflict that wasn't necessary in the first place. There was assumed disagreement that wasn't really there. So that's the sort of phenomenon I'm really interested in.
I am not trying to start a fight with anybody watching this, but I'm just hearing Nancy Pelosi, because I remember during when she was speaker the last 2 years, it was constantly that she was having all these committees to impeach Trump or do this or do that, and in the January 6th committee, and they wouldn't have any Republicans on there because she thought they were totally biased, and that just really upset the Republicans. And it also made it anything that was done was seen as unfair and automatically attacked because the Republicans felt, well, Nancy wasn't forthcoming in allowing all of us in. So whatever product comes out of this January 6th hearing or these impeachment trials has to be disingenuous and wrong, and all the facts have to be off. So we can just go ahead and assume everything coming out of these reports is totally wrong and fake because they didn't invite enough of us Republicans. Totally saw that, beliefs on both sides. Let me ask you a few questions. This meta perception being off on both sides sounds pretty bad. How far back does this go? It wasn't always this way in America. I understand that you can go back to the Revolutionary Founding Fathers, and I think it was John Adams referred to Thomas Jefferson as a transvestite. So I'm not saying that it's always been pretty, but we had a lot more civil. That's a fact, by the way. I just bring that up to say, that it wasn't always pretty. Don't act like, everything was great and everybody like to think. See, he knows. Good point. Thank you for the backup.
My dogs were just barking for no reason. I don't know if you guys could hear that on my microphone, but that's why I turned. My dog was just like, woof, and I jumped.
I think the reason was he liked my point. He's a historian. But you'd see this. So how far back does this go? I remember hearing about Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton, and Newt Gingrich came in, and they used to have this pattern of Republicans and Democrats may talk trash on each other during the day and argue, but at night they'd all have dinner with each other in Washington, D.C. And Newt Gingrich basically ended that and said no more dinners with the other party. Some people have brought up that that's a site. When does this start? When do you notice a significant change in the data? There's got to be some period where you go, yeah, that's different than the last couple of years. I understand a break from one year to the next might be hard to determine, but there's got to be some rough period where you start noticing a change in the data and it's going the wrong way.
That's a great question. So in the micro and the specifics, these questions of meta perceptions are relatively new scientifically, and so there's not a lot of good data going back far at all in terms of those very specific judgments. Now, in terms of like broader polarization, there is good polling data going back a ways. As a scientist, I spend a lot of time thinking about causes and consequences of these misperceptions, and I'm generally skeptical of in the broad strokes of the narrative that like in the past it was sort of kumbaya and now it's uniquely bad, both because we don't really have a lot of good data going back that far. I mean, a lot of the data that we had pre 1970 excluded, most people who weren't white, right? And so there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance where you can look at the data and be like, oh yeah, 1968, that was, a year of minimal polarization. And then you open up a textbook and you're like, wait a minute, that's not actually what the United States looked like in 1968. So there's, and that's a nitty gritty scientific point about like what inferences we can make about certain measures of polarization in the past, but when I think about this, it's really hard to imagine that like back during the founding era where most people didn't go to school, for example, right? We didn't have universal education until the 20th century, that your average voter didn't also hold these misperceptions. Now, there might be reasons to think that they didn't in a way that we might like. There might be some unique circumstances of today that are different from the past. And again, here you have to start thinking about like what's your causal model, right? So some people think that, right, one reasonable causal model is the information that we receive. So if, for example, people interact less with members of the other party more than they used to, less than they used to, right? So maybe that's because of sort of self-segregation, things like that. So maybe we have less exposure directly to individuals of the other party. And maybe alternatively, our sort of stereotypes in the broadest sense of the other party are now coming from hyperpartisan media or from social media, two things that are relatively recent developments. So if you think that that's a potential cause of these misperceptions, then you have, some footing to say maybe these misperceptions, or at least the possibility that they're more prevalent now than they were in the past is caused by those things. There are other potential causes, though. As a psychologist, my background is in intergroup relations, and we tend to think about these as general processes, right? We don't, the sorts of things that lead to intergroup conflict and then can even bubble up to the worst sorts of actual violent conflict, right? There's not a good reason to think that the psychology that leads, Serbians try to kill people in Kosovo is different that leads fighting in the Middle East or versus the Balkans versus Northern Ireland, right? If we have a general model of intergroup conflict across those contexts, then maybe we need a general model of intergroup conflicts now. And maybe, for example, these misperceptions are not the fault of the media or social media, but maybe they're the fault of more basic psychological processes. And because we don't have old data, we don't have data going back long, it's really hard to say. So I have data. We try to show this bias across 20. We find this bias across 25 different countries. And granted, the majority of those countries are European countries, but we see a pretty consistent bias across those countries. So now, if we're seeing it across countries, is it something U.S. specific? Well, the data would suggest no. That's not that data is from 2 years ago, so it's not old data. But all of this is to say that we have competing theories about what causes these, and those theories have different implications for current debates, right? If it's hyperpartisan media and social media, then there's a different prescription than there is, for example, if it's caused by lack of exposure to the other side. There are different prescriptions than if, for example, this is a really basic cognitive bias that you're going to see across contexts, and you really need some broader way of intervening on these misperceptions. Or if you can't intervene on the misperception, at least understanding the behavior it's going to cause and try to stop that behavior if it's a bad behavior, if we have reason to want to stop the behavior. Yeah.
Good point. Good point.
So I mean, because a lot of scientists, like everybody in society, is concerned about polarization, we have often jumped right to trying to correct the misperception. And that, this is myself included. This isn't a critique. This is just a description. So like most of my work looks at, okay, we can measure this misperception. If we show people how they're wrong, they update. And not only do they update the specific misperception, it also makes them less polarized in other domains. Right. So what we find pretty consistently, again, we've done this internationally, we've done this in 9 countries. If you ask people, like, how much do you think the out party, right? So we do this by country. Right? So in England, it's like Labor and Conservatives, and in the United States, it's Democrats, Republicans, etc. How much do you think the out party dislikes the in party? So we ask them that judgment, and then we show them the true value. We say, here's the polling data. Here's what people actually say, and it's almost always significantly lower than they think. And then we say, okay, now that you have this updated belief, how do you feel about the out group? Now that you've learned that the out group doesn't like you as much. Sorry, now that you've learned that the out group likes you more than you thought they did, how do you actually feel about them? And so what we find is that people are more positive, or I guess perhaps I should say less negative, about the out party afterwards, right? So that's evidence for a causal relationship between the misperception and people's own levels of polarization towards the out party. And that sort of thing is where most of the science is being done right now. Interventions that correct misperceptions and demonstrating that they affect other attitudes. What there is much less of, and what some of my research is turning to, is not outcomes, but causes. What's actually causing these misperceptions, right? And that's often, that's a little harder to get at, right? It's easy just to like intervene and then show it makes a change. But, if these misperceptions, for example, are the result of repeated exposure to particular information that might bias your perceptions of the world, then you have to go find what that looks like. And that's harder, right? You have to really look at people's behavior on social media. It's not easy to like actually track people on social, despite what marketers would say it's easy, but it's not. At least for scientists, it's not easy to get hold of that. So it's much easier to figure out what causes these misperceptions than it is to at least attempt to intervene on them and change downstream behaviors. And so I think that's sort of the next wave of research in this domain. But yeah, go ahead.
Before you continue, I just want to summarize for people in the audience. I think you said most of the science on polarization, because we've been talking a lot of researchers who studied polarization. I haven't heard this yet. I want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly from
research on false polarization on these
research. Most of the science on false polarization is on interactions to correct misperception. There is a lot less research on what causes these misperceptions. Is that a fair summary? I'm sorry. Postdoc researcher.
Yes.
Remember what you said. I was about to do it, and then I stopped myself. So I caught myself.
That is, and I would describe this whole scientific literature as relatively young. Like I don't, it's hard to find research on this specific topic that goes back more than 10 years. So that's really young in science. So we're just getting to the point where we're very confident that this bias is, you can consistently observe it across group conflict to say, okay, now we're confident that it happens. We're pretty confident that our interventions work, at least in the short term. Maybe now it's time to turn to the next question, which is what causes it. So I think, as the science grows, I think that's where it's leading to next.
That's fascinating. I had been sensing that this was a boutique subject. It wasn't as well studied as perhaps it should have been. And seems to me this really got popular in academia towards the end of President Obama's second term. So a lot of the papers that I saw came out around then, and people were shocked at how the Republicans and Obama got along. But it's hard to find stuff before that. That's just something I noticed as a casual observer. So yeah, absolutely. So folks, that's important, because if we're talking about political polarization, and the people who are experts in it are saying it's a relatively young field, and we don't have as much research as other things, that's important. That's an important thing to understand as far as our ability in this country to be able to navigate it and deal with it. I want to get back to.
I will
Is
say,
it-
I
I'm
can
sorry.
say one. I can say one thing. As the reason I think that it's growing in this direction is because there's more interdisciplinary work. So political scientists have been interested in polarization for a lot longer than psychologists have. But this idea of meta-perception, that's a psychological construct. And so the intersection of those two, right? How do meta-perceptions in political context, how might they be inaccurate and cause conflict? That's often the result of sort of cross-disciplinary collaborations. And so I think that's also a trend in academia. Doing more interdisciplinary work is becoming more common and easier to do now that it's easier to connect. 10 years ago there wasn't a lot of scientists on Twitter. Now there are a lot of scientists on Twitter, and I don't say that like
Oh,
jokingly.
interesting.
Like I have a lot of collaborations that came solely from interacting with an academic on Twitter. So now that more scientists are interacting with each other in these sort of public forums, they're forming more interdisciplinary collaborations, and you get projects like this.
I will say that's another casual observation that I made, was that in the field of political polarization, at least recently, it appears like half psychologists, half academics now. Is what I'm noticing. And you're kind of moving out from people from a sociology background or political science background and moving into a psychology background or other field. I've seen a lot of that. A lot of psychologists this last 2 years have written books on political polarization, where they just jumped in all on their own and said, I'm going to handle it on my own and trying to understand. I think that's great. So this is kind of a new field. I want to ask about this. Is misperception because of media, social media, or a lack of interaction with the other? I've been asking people about this. Now, the question for me is, I've heard a couple theories. Hyperpolarization is because of social media, right? The algorithms are designed to tear us apart. Okay. Hyperpolarization is because of elite politicians who are extreme and come from the extremes, and they're designed to have messages that rip us apart. Hyperpolarization for politicians wasn't really a problem until the last 2 years of President Trump's presidency, when his example was so ubiquitous. You started seeing a lot of people following it. And then social media wasn't really a problem in elections till maybe 2015. If you want, you can push it back to 2010. But we have evidence that hyperpolarization goes back to 1992. So, namely the theory called the big sort, which showed Americans are sorting themselves into ideological like-minded communities. This has been backed up by multiple organizations. I believe NPR did a 15-year series on it, documenting how it still stayed true. How is hyperpartisanship caused by social media? If social media only goes back to 2015, 2010, or elite politicians, and that only goes back to maybe 2018, when there are other phenomena that go back decades longer into the past. Is that the right place to start digging for gold, or perhaps we're missing a more fertile field to start looking in for our answers? Your thoughts, feelings, Professor? I'm not Professor, postdoc researcher.
Great question. So, while not being certain whether it's true or not, let me lay out for you a model of how recent trends in partisan media, social media, and elite polarization can affect these misperceptions. And that is through like information salience. And also just some baseline accurate perceptions that then people overgeneralize. So let me give you an example. Right, if you're on social media and the only news stories you see are the ones that, even if they do it accurately, but that represent the extremes of the other side, right? If your repeated exposure to the other side is examples of extremism, you might then start to believe that on average the other side is more extreme than it is. Not because you have an inaccurate perception of what you're reading or what you're reading is inaccurate, but because your generalization from what the information that you're seeing to whether that is actually representative of the whole group, that's where the error is. I can give you a good example. You know, so in general, this is also a little bit of a generalization, but in general, the vast majority of Republican politicians in Congress are pro-life. They vote against pro-choice legislation. They openly advocate for pro-life positions. I think we could all agree that's generally true.
Mm-hmm.
It might surprise people to know that polling data suggests that actually only a minority of Republicans are staunchly pro-life. The majority of Republicans actually support some level of legalized abortion. Now, of course, there's a lot of nuance there, but my point is that you can have an accurate perception of what congressional Republicans think, but that accurate perception of what congressional Republicans think can lead you to have an inaccurate perception of what the average Republican voter thinks. So, that's a question of like the relationship again between elites and voters. How much do elites actually represent the average voter? And if the average person thinks that connection is tighter than it actually is, then they can come to these inaccurate inferences of what the other side believes. Right? And that's just the example for Republicans. I could come up with a ton of examples for Democrats as well, where the average congressional Democrat acts in a way that's not necessarily representative of what all Democrats think. Maybe the majority of Democrats or the majority of Republicans, but certainly not all. So there's often this like lack of appreciation for the variance in what the other side believes as a group. And if it is true, which while this is not my area of expertise, my understanding of the literature is that it is, that elites have become more polarized, then an accurate perception of elite polarization might lead to then an inaccurate perception of average voter polarization. That's one mechanism. The other mechanism, again, is the one I mentioned about like exposure, right? So if you're reading 10 articles, like, imagine the average person sees 10 articles about the out party, and if 6 of those articles are about extreme members of the out party doing something particularly extreme, right? Maybe that's why the algorithm's feeding it to you, because it's causing a lot of negative affect. Then you again none of that information can be false, but it's just the generalization of, I just 6 of the last 10 articles were about, members of the Democratic Party who identify as communists, which is like a tiny in reality is a tiny fraction of Democrats, but like, okay, now I think 60% of Democrats are right. It's about the information space and how people generalize from what they see. So like those are mechanisms. That's a plausible mechanism by which these recent trends could be exacerbating false polarization.
That's important. I'd like to show you a few charts, if I may, and ask your opinion.
Sure thing.
Okay. Get to those. One second. Let me get right to it. Okay. Almost there. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. You're good.
There we go.
Lots of charts.
Yeah, I've been putting this information together. We'll start with this one right here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is from the Wall Street Journal, came out in 2020, about 3 years old, how politics has pulled the country in different directions. This is one of a couple charts I'd want to show you before I ask you a question, if I may. And what this says is that in 1974, 45% of Republicans identified themselves as hardcore conservative. In 2016, it was 76%. In 1974, only 28% of Democrats identified as hardcore liberal. In 2016, it was 59%. If you look at that trend, it's kind of straight from 1974 out to roughly 1990, 1992. And then around 92, you start to see a significant uptick for both parties going in one direction, where they become even more entrenched in their sides, etc. That's one poll. This one kind of matches that. But this is my favorite one here. So this is called the Big Sort. This was covered by New York Times in 2016. If you look at the maps, the map in the top left corner, I know it's a little bit difficult to see, but if you look at the map in the top left corner, red means don't even run here if you're a Democrat. You have no chance of winning. I'm sorry. These maps are at the county level for presidential elections. So they may look like large blobs of color, but it goes down to the county level. It's kind of finite. Red means don't run here if you're a Democrat. You have no chance of winning. Republicans always win by 20 percentage points or more, what's called a landslide voting county. Blue means don't even run here if you're a Republican. You have no chance. Democrats win here by 20 percentage points or more. Another Democrat landslide voting county. But gray means competitive election. Maybe we voted for Obama, and then the next year we voted for Trump or McCain. We kind of vote on who we think has the right message at the time based upon the issues the country's facing. A competitive election. You can see how from 1992, and then it covers year increments every 4 years. We go down to 2016 is the map at the bottom, the big one. Almost all the grays wiped out. It's almost all hardcore red, hardcore blue, and that goes from 1992 to 2016, which kind of matches the other chart we were showing. And then we can look at NPR and showing people are sorting themselves out to different areas. This kind of looks like this problem got started, especially if we look at those maps and this chart around the 90s. That predates social media by about 15 to 20 years and elite politicians by about 20 years. One of the things that started me on this journey of interviewing people was that Marjorie Taylor Greene, whatever you think about her, whatever, came out on President's Day and said, we need a national divorce because red and blue can't get along. Okay, some people hate her, some people like her, not what we're here for. But then the idea was, oh, well, she's just doing that because of, political division isn't a real issue. We all get along. And if it is, it's something we can fix with social media regulation, or maybe fixing gerrymandering, or maybe some new election laws to get less elite politicians. I almost saw no discussion in the month after Marjorie Taylor Greene for national divorce saying, hey, folks, there's this idea that political polarization goes back 3 decades. Almost all of the newspaper articles by anybody the month after she said national divorce were, A, we're not that polarized, and B, if we are, it's really just social media and elite politicians. How did so many newspapers forget to mention the Big Sort as a potential theory when it goes back 2 decades before the others? I found it really bizarre that there was almost no mention of this theory and almost only an exclusive focus on social media and elite politicians. I understand that you're not a reporter or a professor in journalism, but perhaps you could speculate as to why there might be a total dearth of any acknowledgement of the Big Sort and a seemingly partisan preference to focus on just social media and elite politicians. What's going on? Why would people do that?
I think it's a great question. I definitely agree with your criticism, and I think I mentioned this earlier, I'm generally skeptical of this idea that we're uniquely polarized now more than any time. Like, I think all the evidence, you've shown much of it here, that the trends that have led us to our current situation are older trends. That you can at a national level trace back to the 90s, but possibly even back farther.
Fair.
Yeah, and so as someone who studies false polarization, I often try to emphasize that I'm not saying that polarization doesn't exist or that it isn't bad. Like, by far, this sort of the way often scientists talk about it is like the cross-ticket voting. So, like, people who are willing to vote for a Democrat or a Republican versus voting party line. So, like, party line voting has increased significantly over the past, since it's been measured well. So in modern era of the United States, and there are a lot of reasons for that. I could talk at length about my frustration with the media. I
focus.
I mean, I think it's the boogeyman du jour, like social media, and I think so. I think there's two. I think it is the boogeyman du jour, and you will find social media being blamed for a lot of things without much evidence that it's actually the cause of those things. I think the media has a bias towards. I think in many respects the media is like us all, where we sort of we have this bias towards a rosy view of the past, right? So I think that's a general bias that reporters have as much as the average person, right? Again, my parents grew up in the late 60s, early 70s, and so every time they say something to me today, like, oh, it's just totally different than I was a kid, and I was like, really? You sure? I was like, you told me about the number of soldiers that were on the street the day after Martin Luther King was killed. That sounds like not very fun. Not to say that it's, I obviously wasn't there, but I think there's
good point.
So I think some of it is that.
Good point.
And I think
we have a tendency as humans to nostalgia. I'm not getting the right word. Make nostalgic the past, romanticize the past.
And I'll put the following in relation to how I think about scientific ethics, right? So, like, one could make the criticism that in trying to whatever depolarization means, in trying to depolarize, what we are actually doing is trying to sort of silence legitimate criticism or stifle legitimate debate and conflict. And I think it's a criticism I take very seriously as a scientist who develops depolarization interventions. And the way I think about it, and one of the reasons that I find inaccurate beliefs a fruitful and ethically more justifiable domain of research, is because it helps us identify the things that we actually disagree about that are worth fighting over. Right? The vision of the perfect world is not a kumbaya world. It's a world where we know where we agree and we know where we disagree, and we only fight about the things that we actually disagree about, right? We don't have these meaningless fights over things that we actually have agreement on. We don't inadvertently, either interpersonally or at a political level, insult or stereotype other people. But none of that is to suggest that Republicans and Democrats do not have strong disagreements, and that the way that those strong disagreements play out ought to be through the political process, right? That's what democracy is for. And to circle back to your question, I think the media sometimes doesn't appreciate that critique I levied against myself, which is, I think there is often a bias towards, like, the kumbaya mindset of why can't we all get along, rather than saying our role as the media should be to help people understand where they agree and disagree, so that the process of democracy can be at its most productive, which is not necessarily its most calm.
I love that. That's roughly where I'm going. And the question that I had for people that really seems to disturb them and nobody really wants to answer, and you don't have to answer. I'm not asking you, I'm just putting out there, but I'll go, okay, so we have a bunch of news agencies who say they're about getting the facts straight and checking their facts, and misinformation and fake news is wrong and you need to trust them. And then they decide there's certain things you don't need to hear because it's depressing or it's not good for national cohesion. Almost like they're censoring the news to make sure your delicate minds won't be broken because it goes against the national project. Isn't that exactly what Chinese media does?
I mean, I would. I mean, I don't. There
They just
are there are a
they
lot of
just
new.
they decide
I
what's the right tone for the Chinese people, and what's bad ideas for them to hear because they're protective of the delicate Chinese mind.
well, so I think about it in two ways. Insofar as your characterization is accurate, I think there is a lot of paternalism. I think that's a plausible piece of this. Um, the reason that it is fruitful to distinguish between a state-controlled media and the media in the United States is because I think the systemic critique is about incentives, right? Where in China the incentive is to appease the communist boss. In the United States, it's profit. And I think that understanding those incentives is necessary to understand the ways in which the failures of our media are tied to those incentives. The hyper partisanship, so for example, hyper partisan media. So the quote unquote hate clicks, right? So you get clicks equals money, hate equals more clicks, ergo
Right,
more hate.
right.
Um, but also the editorialization of the news. As someone who has my entire adult life, I've been very involved in politics. I've been reading the news. I read the news every morning. And the biggest trend that I've noticed is the shift is just the proliferation of editorialism and opinion pages, right? Nowadays, and like that's money driven because both because those might get more clicks because the aforementioned like hate click cycle, but also because it's a lot cheaper to pay one op-ed writer to write one shallow op-ed than it is to pay a reporter to go do good reporting for 2 months that will produce one story as well. So I think of a lot of the media problems, a lot of the dynamics of the media that are problematic as being rooted in that profit motive. And I mean,
Sure.
people like no one has ever figured out a good way to get around that. So I don't have an answer to that. But in terms of diagnosing the ways in which the media is problematic, and
Okay.
and this is not to say that like obviously reporters there's discretion involved in what to report and what not to report. What I find, we can critique a lot of individual decisions. What I find frustrating is the constant assertion that they're doing that in a non-ideological fashion when that's obviously not true. And it's like, as a scientist, I mean, I study motivated reasoning, right? So like I would be the last person to say I'm purely objective. But the best way to combat that is to say, here's what I think my biases are, and here are the decisions that I've made. Feel free to interrogate them. Like that's how scientists operate, ideally, where the news says we're biased, we're objective, and we're not going to show you the process, right? So you don't know what decisions we've made. We are not going to take seriously any criticism that we have some unspoken ideological bias. And we're just going to demand that you treat us like a untouchable fourth estate, and like the fourth estate is important, but those are the sorts of things that frustrate me as a consumer of the news.
So the causes are different. Hey, we're not censoring the media in America because of ideology, it's for profit. And in China, they're censoring media for ideology. But it also sounds like the end result is the same. There's a group of people who don't tell you their decision-making process, don't tell you all the information, and they decide for you because they think they know better than you, what information you should see because your mind is delicate and they're worried about having a tough discussion. Radically different. It reminds me of the Soviet Union. I believe it was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I believe that he was going to sort out the communists and let them know how capitalism was great. And he went into a meeting with Nikita Khrushchev and talked about censorship. And he got his ass handed to him because the Soviets were able to go, you guys censor more than us. It's just a different type. And this is a historical fact. Kennedy walked out of that meeting not even be able to defend American system of censorship against the USSR. He was embarrassed. So you can look that up. Let me get to, I'm not making that up. That actually happened. He was like, no, we're better than you. And we don't, and Khrushchev wiped the floor with him. And we only know about that because the diplomats wrote notes, and the Russian notes and the American notes were released like 20, 30 years later, and they matched. So this was a rumor. We didn't hear about this during the Cold War. Yeah. Your guy's better than ours, whatever. Turned out to be completely true. JFK, one of the greatest speakers, one of the greatest leaders for the American thing, could not stand up against Khrushchev, explaining how we don't do censorship in America. Totally lost that debate. Perhaps reminiscent of now. Let's get down to the final questions. How bad, you've looked at multiple countries, you've looked at things in the past. How bad is polarization in America now? Is it a little bit worse than other countries, a little bit worse than in the past? Or, oh my God, you're at the tail end of OECD countries that are able to not fall apart. And polarization is the worst we have any measures for in American history that we have metrics for. How bad is this compared to others, compared to our past?
Great question. Let me give you the short answer and then the scientist answer. So the short the short answer is like, just by most metrics, we're, at least on false polarization, we're kind of middle of the pack. On most measures of polarization, we're pretty bad. But the scientist hat, right? What we care about polarization, however we define it, because we think it affects behavior. And there is a growing body of evidence to suggest that it doesn't actually affect as much behavior as we think. And the example that I have seen used by other scientists is that, the self-reported distrust, hate of the other side in the United States is quantitatively equivalent to Israel and Palestine. So if you ask Israelis and Palestinians how much they dislike each other, and immediately that should make you a little suspicious about the relationship between those self-espoused feelings and behavior, because obviously the United States is not Israel-Palestine. We're not, stuck in a decades-long brutal war with each other. And in fact, the scientists who this was at a conference, they pointed out they had taken a lot of these interventions, these corrective interventions that I described earlier, that work in the United States, tried them in Israel and Palestine, and they didn't work. And so what they were suggesting is that maybe these measures of polarization are themselves exacerbating the difference. Maybe they are actually reflective. And the point that they were making is maybe they're actually reflective of these sort of misperceptions to begin with. People are saying, oh, I hate the other side, more than they actually do, because they think that's normal. They think that's what they're supposed to do, right? I don't want to look weak among my in-group, sort of thing. But in fact, when you sort of push them, they're actually like, no, I don't actually think that, in a way that's not true. That responding is less sincere than it is in a war zone like Israel-Palestine. So yeah, that's my scientist hat, which is that is not to downplay trends. As I mentioned earlier, like the voting trends are clear, right? Voting is a real behavior, and the voting trends are clear. People vote much more party lines. That is a meaningful change. Many argue it's not a good change. And so, like, it's not that polarization hasn't happened among people, among elites, but to circle back to the very beginning, the core point in that article we started with, what we mean when we say polarization is important, because so often we use that term to describe all the bad things. It becomes really difficult to talk about it in a meaningfully scientific way. Like, what specifically are we talking about? What do we think causes it specifically? So yeah.
Could you repeat that part about polarization in the U.S. is on some surveys as bad as Israel-Palestine, or did I mishear that?
No, you heard that correctly.
So in your research study that we were covering, you found that looking at other countries that polarization.
This is not my research. This is someone else's research, but yes. So I get into the technical details, but basically, like the way that when you ask Israelis and Palestinians, like how much they don't like each other, they're on average their ratings of how much they don't like each other are the same as how much Democrats and Republicans don't like each other. Self-reported dislike.
Could you email me that study later?
This was at a conference, so I'd have to dig it up. In fact, I can tell you. Let me send you this. This is a professor. She is great. Her and I talked. Let me just make sure I get her. I always struggle with her first name, but I have it written down. Give me 1 second to
You're
find
awesome.
it.
You're a beautiful human, by the way.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for this person because she is epic. And
of course.
Let's see.
You're not saying anything. I'm just asking for a name. I'll deal with it on my own.
Here we go. Samara Klar. She is a professor at the University of Arizona. I'll put it in the chat.
KLAR?
Correct. University of Arizona.
Got it. Samara Klar, University of Arizona.
Yeah.
Okay.
And awesome. So she's doing some ongoing work in Israel on these interventions. And so she could speak, Israel, Palestine is not my area of expertise, but that's how she framed the beginning of her talk was like, hey, look, when you ask people, they look the same, but then basically all the downstream behaviors are different. What does that say about this measurement? Maybe this measurement is not actually capturing what we think it is.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Great discussion. So last as we're winding down, last one or two questions. So this field of political polarization, I'm sure I'm not saying this perfectly correctly, is relatively young. Aspects of it are super young, maybe the fetal stage of academia compared to other fields like sociology, psychology that go back over 100 years, et cetera. And a lot of the research has been on how to get people to come back together versus why the polarization is happening. You're in America. I'm imagining you're an American and you're an academic professor, but you also live here. So it gets a little real. Are the signs good that we're going to have a kumbaya moment in the near future and people are going to realize that, oh, they got it wrong. Not all those January 6th people were there for an insurrection. And when Joe Biden said that all MAGA people are a existential threat to the country, he didn't really mean the same as an Al-Qaeda threat. Let's calm down. How soon till we have people knocking off that language and calming it down? Or is there no real reason to believe we're going to get there naturally without some super intervention, which we're still waiting to have?
I would cite every person that confidently made a political prediction in the last 5 years in saying that. I mean, I don't think things are going to get eminently better quickly. It's almost trite to be like, we need structural reform, right? We need more competitive races. We need, democratization in a lot of ways, right? Like elite polarization might be traceable to uncompetitive districts. There's a
sure.
And so those are structural reforms.
How do we fix this? Or does it fix it? Or does it? Part of the issue I have that I've come with professors is they're going, okay, we're looking into research. We're trying to figure this out. Great. And I've talked to other people going, we're starting to have conversations, reaching out to the other side. Great. Does all that happen fast enough before Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall and splits apart and can't be put back together?
I do not know. If I had a confident answer for you, I would be being insincere.
That's the answer. That's all. I appreciate it. I know it's a tough question.
No. I guess the most honest answer I can give is like doing nothing feels like a worst option. Right? I could go study.
yeah.
I could change my research topic, but yeah. So like doing nothing feels like a worse option.
Yeah, of course. Don't just roll over and let it happen. I'm just wondering because I see people going, this isn't that bad. We need to come back together and we'll have everybody, start reaching out to each other. And I go, great. Have you done that? No. Have you even talked to somebody on the other side? No. But I know it's the answer.
Well, I feel that now. Like, I moved to my current house during COVID, and then right when the lockdowns were lifted, had a kid, and so like, there's a part of me that's like, thank you. So it's like, there's a part of me that's like, I want to go out and meet new people and make friends and like have a diverse social network. And it's like, oh, actually, it's just been like, taking care of my toddler instead. But no, enacting these values is hard. I mean,
it's just a question I have. I've noticed a lot of professors, and they were awesome, and they were saying, here's the way we need to, turn the other cheek and be willing to think like the other person and maybe assume their motives are good and reach out to them. And I would go, great. Tell me about the person you did that with. And I think one or two could mention one or two people they had done that with. And I go, okay, at this rate, we're going to have America fixed in about 200 years. So awesome. I'm sure it won't get worse in the next 2 centuries. All we have to do is make sure we hold the line for 200 more years, and then we'll get all better. And I'm like, that's no comment, but just something I've seen. Okay, last question I was going to ask. Yeah, I'll let you go. Last question I want to ask, though. Picture yourself. You're not you. You're outside of this. You're watching this. You thought that the interview was pretty good, but 5 days from now, you're going, I don't remember everything about that interview, but there was this one thing the speaker said, and I can't get it out of my head. What is that one thought 5 days from now you want an average viewer you've never met to not be able to stop thinking about?
Great question. That we all have very inaccurate beliefs about what other people believe. And we tend to be pretty confident in those beliefs. And it affects our behavior. It makes us less likely to want to talk to our friends and family who we know disagree with us on a lot of things. And there's actually a lot of good research interpersonally. People avoid friends and family because they think they disagree more, because they anticipate those interactions being negative. And the research is unequivocal. When people actually do approach, they never regret it. I mean, not never, but you know what I mean.
If you could think about anybody else who may be willing to be part of a conversation like this, you don't have to say. I'll email you a copy of the video in a few hours. But if you could think of anybody, I hope you found that this interview was fair and not gotcha journalism. And we'd like to just continue the conversation.
Of course. This was a blast. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'll email you soon. Thank you, postdoc researcher, for being here. I deeply appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.